My homie from the west side, I was smiling in this Cadillac. When the politician officers for the Cadillacs, I be up.
Hello again, FSC, Fest Check Speed and Custom Shop. Well, once again, my Cadillac decided to show me it wants to complain. And I'm going to have to show it who's boss around here. Earlier, I put a new thermostat and gasket in there. It had a 195 in it. I backed it down to a 180. Put it in, filled up the antifreeze, fired it up, ran it, got it up to temperature. Everything was fine. Turned it off. A couple minutes later, I decided, okay, let's move the car, back it out of the garage, turn the key, crank, 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 crank. Don't start. Now what? Is it the car security system with that old school VATS ignition with that chip in your key? Is that what's causing a problem? It's cranking. Does it have fuel pressure? Did the fuel pump go out? It has been sitting for a long time, and considering I have had this car for a few years, it has sat for 8 or 9 years, somewhere in that range. Who knows what it could be? So let's dive into it. I think I got an idea, but let me show you. Well, that doesn't sound right. Well, I was running the car earlier, got it up to operating temperature, and it started giving me problems. Now, here's some of the things that I could tell you. This car, being a 1990, has the old VATS ignition. What they do is they put a resistor, which is what this is, in your key. And if that resistor isn't right, it will trigger a security alarm and not allow the car to fire. Now, I do know it will turn over and crank, but it won't start if that's wrong. However, look down here in this car. An information center. See the security light? I'll cycle it again. It goes out. I heard the fuel pump come on. Maybe you did. And it will not start. So the next logical step you got to determine for yourself is it a fuel problem or is it an ignition problem? The security light goes out and it doesn't stay steady on. Now, the security light doesn't stay on, which tells me that the security system's running just fine. We have just a typical normal failure. There's 3 things you need: air, fuel, and ignition. Without any of them 3, it ain't running. Now, there is a way to check the fuel on the side of the rail. You could open up the side. There's a cap on the side of the fuel rail. Open it up and push the Schrader valve in, and some fuel should spurt out. Once that happens, you'll notice fuel. Now, that doesn't mean the fuel injectors are spitting into the cylinders, as this is multi-point injection, not throttle body injection. However, you can try and pour a little bit of gasoline that you spilled out of the fuel rail down the throttle body. And if it don't start on that, then you know your problem is ignition. So one thing you could do right here is check for fuel pressure. This is the fuel rail. That's the distributor right there. Take the cap off, and inside there's a little Schrader valve. Just put a little something underneath there to catch the spray. So we notice fuel pressure there. Put a little bit of fuel in the carb right down into the throttle body. Turn the key and it doesn't even make an attempt. So now the next step, take your voltmeter, and this just jumps straight across the battery. So the battery's up with 12.65 volts. Unplug the wire from your coil right here, and then attach. We have 12.55 volts at the coil, but I already checked spark, and we didn't get spark earlier. I'll show you. This metal piece right here is attached directly to the engine block, and we're going to put a little gap right there, just enough to ground it, so after it cranks, you should see a spark jump across those two terminals. I see no such spark. Last thing you do is try checking the connector. So the car is off. What we'll do is we'll take the cover off the coil. Now exposing your ignition coil. So now we'll check voltage with the car turned on to the right pins. The car is now turned on. We have power to the coil wire. So you disconnect the distributor trigger or reluctor from the bottom inside parts of here, and then remove the 4 bolts that hold the coil to the distributor cap. Take these pins out. As you can tell, they are not the cleanest of connectors. However, you did see they did work. We are keeping the original push button that goes on top of the rotor. We are changing the rubber gasket that goes underneath. I did replace this when I used the old coil and put it in the new distributor cap. I did change that. Some people change ignition coil when they change the distributor cap and rotor. I did not. There comes to a point where you just have to question yourself, how much money do you want to spend on things that maybe don't need to be bought? As far as I knew, the ignition coil was okay. So why change it? So, put the new coil in. That piece I put in there contacts here via that spring. The spark travels through that spring. Right like so. Red one goes in there. They are fairly tight, but they go in. Make sure, see this wire? That it loops inside, not outside. You pinch the wire and then you'd be changing this all over again, wondering what happened. And there's your ground. When installing a new ignition coil, always use the right bolts that come with the new coil, not the bolts that were in the old coil. Reason being, the metal piece surrounding the coil could be a different thickness. If you put too long of a bolt into your cap, you could break your cap. Obviously, you don't want to do that. A cracked distributor cap will cause problems in the future, so you want to avoid that. Now I will reattach the reluctor portion of the distributor or trigger to the cap, sorry, to the coil itself. I'll now hook up the lead wire to the distributor. As you should say, I will now hook up the lead wire to the coil. The cap is off. There's a reason for that. So now I have the ability to check to make sure I do have power to the coil again, just to be on the safe side that we don't have a problem. So now the ignition is turned on. And this is direct to the battery. And that is to the coil wire. I turn the ignition back off. And now we will put the cap back on the ignition coil. Let's go ahead and put the cap back on the fuel Schrader valve. And just like that, we seem to have solved, finally, the intermittent start and stop problems. It would start just fine when it was cold, and then it wouldn't start after you shut it off. Turns out, bad coil. I showed you step by step how to check that. Now, if you don't think you can handle this, or it gets a little too complicated for you, and you just don't want to mess with the aggravation, or you have one of these old cars laying around and you know it's got a gaggle of problems here and there, and you just want to get it running, give me a shout. 920-202-4036. I am Steve Feschek. This is FSC, Feschek Speed and Custom Shop. This is my Cadillac. We've talked about this in previous videos. What else can I build for you?
Let's ride. Let's ride. Let's ride. My homie from the west side,